September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The air was thick, a wet woolen blanket draped over the crushed coral of the runway. In the operations tent, the heat was a physical presence smelling of canvas sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a living legend of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, paused. His hand scarred and steady hovered over an intelligence report. He read it again. His one good eye. The left one scanned the translated text. The right eye was gone blinded by a .50 caliber bullet from an American Dauntless dive bomber's rear gun over Guadalcanal a year prior. An injury that had forced him to fly 60 agonizing miles back to base. His skull fractured, his body paralyzed on one side, navigating by instinct alone. He had survived. He had returned. He was the embodiment of the samurai spirit, indomitable, skilled, and proven by trial of fire. The words on the page were so absurd he laughed, a dry, sharp sound that cut through the humidity. The Americans, the report stated, had produced a new fighter. Heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They called it Hellcat. His fellow pilots gathered for the morning briefing leaned in. Sakai read the specifications aloud. The new aircraft, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, reportedly weighed over 12,000 pounds. Twice the weight of their own Mitsubishi A6M0. The tent filled with derisive laughter. Another American failure. Another flying truck. Through the tent flaps, they could see their own machines glistening in the tropical sun, lined up on the pierced steel planking. The A6M0. It was not just an aircraft, it was a philosophy. Sleek, nimble, impossibly light. A scalpel in a sky full of hammers. For 2 years, these aircraft had dominated the Pacific. They had swept the skies clean. British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, Dutch Brewster Buffaloes, all had fallen before the Zero's guns, all had been humiliated by its supernatural turning ability. This new American attempt, this Hellcat, this bloated, overweight, underwinged monstrosity would be no different. It was another failure of design, another example of the American obsession with heavy metal armor and brute force over finesse and skill. What Saburo Sakai didn't know, what none of the pilots laughing in that humid tent knew, was that their world was about to end. What they held in their hands was not a joke. It was a death warrant. In exactly 30 days, this failure would begin the systematic industrial-scale annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. The F-6F Hellcat, the aircraft they mocked, would rewrite the laws of aerial combat. It would achieve a final staggering kill ratio of 19-1. It would destroy 223 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the war. In exchange, only 270 Hellcats would be lost to enemy fighters. It would transform carrier warfare from a duelist game to a science of extermination. It would break the back of Japanese air power, bleed its pilot corps white, and prove that the Zero's reign of terror had been built on a foundation of fatal philosophical assumptions. The mathematics of aerial supremacy were about to be rewritten. Not by a warrior, but by an accountant. Not by a scalpel, but by a machine. Within 6 months, the very pilots now laughing at intelligence reports would be writing final letters home, knowing that an encounter with Hellcats meant a statistical certainty of death. The confidence of this Japanese Navy in September 1943 was not arrogance. It was a conclusion based on overwhelming evidence. It was mathematics. Since the dawn raid on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, the Dai Nippon, Teikoku, Kaigan, Koku, Hanbu had achieved victory ratios that defied Western logic. At Pearl Harbor, they lost 29 aircraft. They destroyed or damaged 347. In the Philippines, 7 losses. 103 American aircraft destroyed on the ground and in the air. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 losses. 30 Allied aircraft shot down. The British Far East Fleet's air arm was annihilated. The Dutch East Indies Air Force was eliminated in a matter of days. The American P-40s flown by the vaunted Flying Tigers were formidable, but they were shot down in droves when they couldn't dictate the terms of the fight. The Brewster Buffalo, which the Americans had supplied to the British and Dutch, was so hopelessly outclassed it was known to its pilots as the Flying Coffin. At the center of this hurricane of victories flew the Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero. Codenamed Zeke by the Allies, it was an aircraft that had rewritten the rules of fighter design. When Allied engineers first tested a captured example, the famous Akutan Zero, recovered intact from an Alaskan island in 1942, they refused to believe the performance figures. They ran the tests again and again. The data seemed impossible. Here was a fighter with the operational range of a light bomber, capable of flying for over 600 miles. It could climb like a rocket, and it could maneuver with the agility of a pre-war biplane. It seemed to violate the known laws of aerodynamics. The Zero was the masterpiece of designer Jiro Horikoshi. His directive from the Imperial Navy had been explicit and uncompromising: build a carrier fighter that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange any other fighter on Earth. To achieve this, Horikoshi made a series of revolutionary and ultimately fatal choices. He built the airframe from a new top-secret alloy Extra Super Duralumin. It was lighter and stronger than any aluminum the Americans were using, allowing for a structure 30% lighter than comparable designs. Then he removed everything that added weight. There was no armor plate to protect the pilot. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks. The radio was often removed to save another 30 pounds. Even the paint was applied in the thinnest possible layer. Every ounce was sacrificed for one thing: performance. The Zero was not a machine of war. It was an instrument of art. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would become Japan's ace of aces with 87 confirmed kills, described it perfectly in his recovered diary. Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. American planes fly like trucks, powerful but clumsy. They build fighters like they build cars, heavy, overbuilt, wasteful. This was the philosophy. The pilot's skill was his armor. The Zero's maneuverability was its shield. In a one-on-one turning fight, the dogfight that had defined air combat since 1918, the Zero was invincible, and the Japanese pilots were without question the best in the world. The pre-war naval pilot training program was perhaps the most demanding military school on Earth. It took 3 years. Candidates were subjected to brutal physical and mental conditioning. Of the hundreds who entered, only a handful would graduate. Those who did entered combat with a minimum of 700 flight hours. They were artists of aerial combat, trained in aerobatics gunnery, in the spiritual philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior. They were samurai of the sky. This combination of the perfect aircraft and a perfect pilot had shattered Allied air power across an ocean. Then came the first reports of the F6F Hellcat trickling in through neutral Swedish sources in early 1943. The specifications seemed like clumsy propaganda, or perhaps deliberate misinformation designed to fool Japanese intelligence. The aircraft weighed 1,186 pounds loaded. The 05-800. Its wing area was 334 square feet wrapped around a huge drag-inducing radial engine. It carried 400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. It had armor plate everywhere, bulletproof glass for the windscreen, self-sealing tanks that held a massive 250 gallons of fuel. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, the specifications were reviewed by Captain Minoru Genda. This was the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, a man revered as the Navy's foremost aviation mind. His analysis, preserved in the Japanese Defense Archives, was utterly dismissive. The Americans have learned nothing. This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with weight of machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it. It is a target. The mathematics seemed to support his assessment. The Zero's wing loading, a key measure of turning ability, was 22 pounds per square foot. This gave it a phenomenal turning radius of just 612 feet. The Hellcat's wing loading was 36.5 pounds per square foot. Its theoretical turning radius was over 900 feet. In a turning fight, the basis of all Japanese fighter tactics, the Hellcat would be helpless. The Japanese belief was built on 2 years of bloody proof. The Americans built clumsy, heavy, fragile aircraft. The P-40 was a brick. The F-4F Wildcat, the Hellcat's predecessor, was tougher, but it was still slow, sluggish, and could be outmaneuvered at will. The Japanese pilots had perfected the Hinarikomi, the violent snap roll, to get on an enemy's tail. They were masters of the vertical climb and the stall turn. They believed in their planes, in their training, and in their spiritual superiority. What they could not understand, what Genda and Sakai could not see, was that the Americans were no longer interested in playing their game. The shock of the Zero had sent tremors all the way to the top of the U.S. Navy. But even before the Akutan Zero was recovered, one man already knew the answer. His name was Leroy Grumman. His company, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, was known as the 'the Iron Works'. Their philosophy was the mirror opposite of Jiro Horikoshi's. They believed in their planes and their training, and in their spiritual superiority. What they could not understand, what Genda and Sakai could not see, was that the Americans were no longer interested in playing their game. The shock of the Zero had sent tremors all the way to the top of the U.S. Navy. But even before the Akutan Zero was recovered, one man already knew the answer. His name was Leroy Grumman. His company, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, was known as the 'Iron Works'. Their philosophy was the mirror opposite of Jiro Horikoshi's. Grumman built planes that were tough, reliable, and easy to repair. They were designed to take incredible punishment and, above all, bring the pilot home. The F4F Wildcat was a perfect example. It was slow, but it had armor self-sealing tanks and could absorb hundreds of rounds. In 1941, U.S. Navy test pilots flying the captured Zero against the Wildcat confirmed the grim reality. The Wildcat couldn't turn with it. It couldn't climb with it. But a handful of veteran pilots, most notably Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thack, had figured something out in the desperate air battles of 1942. The Wildcat had two advantages. It could dive much faster than the lightweight Zero, and it could take a punch. Thack developed a tactic that would change the war. It was called the Thack Weave. It required two planes flying side by side. When a Zero latched onto one's tail, the two American planes would turn towards each other. The Zero, forced to follow its target, would suddenly find itself flying directly into the sights of the other American fighter. It was a tactic that required teamwork, discipline, and crucially, a radio. This tactic was a partial solution, but the Navy needed a total solution. They needed a new fighter. Leroy Grumman and his chief engineer, Jake Swerble, went to work. They didn't try to build a lighter, more nimble plane. They didn't try to copy the Zero. They decided to double down on the American philosophy. They took the most powerful naval engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower monster, and built the smallest, most rugged airframe they could wrap around it. They added more armor, more ammunition, stronger wings that could withstand high-speed dives. They built it to be a platform for the Thack Weave. They built it to be an energy fighter. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to never need to. It was designed to dictate the terms of the engagement. It would use its superior horsepower to climb above the Zero. It would use its heavy weight to dive on the Zero at speeds the Japanese plane couldn't match. It would fire its .650 caliber guns, and then use its speed to climb back to altitude safe from retribution. It was a system, a cold, brutal physical equation. Horsepower, altitude, speed, and armor. Faith cannot armor steel. The Japanese pilots laughing in their tent at Rabaul were samurai. They were about to fight a machine. The first glimpse came on September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island, petty officer. First Class Yoshio Fukui was flying escort for a reconnaissance mission. He was a veteran confident in his Zero. High over the water, he spotted them. 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast. His first thought recorded in his after-action report was confusion. B-25 bombers on a strange heading. They were too big, too bulky to be fighters. Then they turned. He saw the distinctive silhouette. Single engine, a massive fuselage, wings that seemed too short for the body. First encounter with F6F type fighter, he would write. Initial impression, Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Fukui did what he had always done. He engaged with standard tactics. He rolled his nimble Zero into a diving turn, expecting the heavy American fighter to lumber straight ahead, allowing him to curve neatly onto its 600 position. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Hellcat didn't run. It didn't try to turn with him. It went vertical. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly 700 more than the Zero's Nakajima Sake, did the impossible. The bloated American fighter didn't just climb. It clawed its way upstairs, pulling away from the lighter, more aerodynamic Zero. Fukui, attempting to follow, watched his airspeed decay. His Zero, so brilliant at sea level, was struggling against gravity, its engine gasping for air. At 15,000 feet, the Hellcat performed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for an aircraft of its weight. It executed a perfect hammerhead turn, pivoting at the top of its climb and dropped directly onto Fukui's tail. The world dissolved into noise. The American opened fire at 400 meters, Fukui reported. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was unprecedented. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. A .50 caliber round is a devastating weapon. It's a small explosive shell. 17 of them should have vaporized the unarmored Zero. By sheer luck, Fukui was not hit. Only by dropping into a spin did I escape. He survived. He barely made it back to Marcus Island, his Zero riddled with holes, its light duralumin skin shredded like paper. His wingman, Petty Officer 2nd Class Masao, didn't return. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they were escorting. First blood to the Hellcat. The encounter was a shock, but it was dismissed as an anomaly. Perhaps an exceptional American pilot. Perhaps Fukui had made a mistake. The doctrine remained unchanged. Then came October 5th, 1943. Task Force 14, a new American carrier group, struck Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept what appeared to be another nuisance raid. American carriers had been launching these hit-and-run attacks for months, usually fleeing before Japanese fighters could fully engage. This time would be different. "We climbed to 20,000 feet, Shiga recorded in his diary. "Below us, 12 F6F fighters in 3 divisions. We held every advantage. Altitude position surprise. Victory was certain. The 12 Zeros peeled off diving on the unsuspecting Americans. The engagement that followed, just a few minutes long, shattered Japanese tactical doctrine. As the Zeros dove, the Hellcats didn't scatter. They didn't panic. They didn't try to turn. They simply maintained formation, nose down into a gentle dive, and accelerated. The Zeros opening fire at maximum range watched their 7.7mm bullets spark harmlessly off the American planes. The Hellcats were built to take this. The 212 pounds of armor plate protected the pilot. Another 110 pounds shielded the oil system. The self-sealing tanks simply absorbed the hits, as the Zeros, their ammunition exhausted in the first pass, swept past the Hellcats, executed their counterattack. Instead of turning to dogfight, they used their weight as a weapon. They pulled back on their sticks, engaged their superchargers, and began to climb. They climbed at 3,500 feet per minute. The Zeros trying to follow fell behind. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where the Zero's engine was starving for oxygen, the Hellcat was still producing 650 horsepower. The Zero was down to 900. The Zeros were now trapped. Below them, the ocean. Above them, 12 Hellcats holding all the energy. "They came down on us like hawks on sparrows," Shiga wrote. "Their weight gave them speed we couldn't match. They would dive fire those 6 terrible guns, then climb away before we could react. If we tried to turn, they ignored us. If we tried to climb, they were already above us. It was a massacre. 8 Zeros were shot down. 8 of Japan's skilled pilots lost in minutes. No Hellcats were lost. The surviving pilots returned to base in shock. The Americans had not fought. They had simply executed. The rules had changed. Word spread. Panic was too strong a word, but a deep, cold uncertainty began to creep into the ready rooms. The new American fighter was not a truck. It was a monster. November 11th, 1943. Rabaul. The same base where Sakai had laughed 2 months earlier. The laughter was gone. The assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group listened in grim silence as Lieutenant Commander Tao Tanamizu briefed them. Tanamizu, with 32 victories, was one of the few aces who had survived multiple encounters with Hellcats. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them, his voice flat. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanamizu explained what the Japanese pilots were slowly, fatally learning. The Hellcat wasn't designed to dogfight. It was designed to never dogfight. It was a platform for a new kind of warfare, energy fighting. Hellcat pilots were trained to maintain speed and altitude at all costs. They converted potential energy altitude into kinetic energy speed in slashing high-speed attacks. They gave the Zero pilots no chance to use their superior maneuverability. They work in pairs. Tanamizu continued describing the Thatch weave. "One high, one low. While you engage one, the other is already diving on you. Their radios, which we laughed at for adding weight, let them coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a machine." The Japanese pilots trained in the code of Bushido found this new tactic to be cowardly. The Americans refused to engage in a proper duel. They used teamwork and radios. They struck and ran. But it was a cowardice that was leaving the skies empty of Zeros. The Japanese pilots had no answer. Their aircraft, the lightweight unarmored Zero, could not dive with the Hellcat. If it tried, its wings would tear off. It could not climb with the Hellcat at high altitude, and it could not survive the Hellcat's guns. In December 1943, at Truk Lagoon, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida inspected the damage. Fuchida was the man who had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor, who had famously radioed Tora, Tora, Tora. Now he served as air operations officer for the combined fleet. He studied the Zeros returning from encounters with Hellcats, or rather, the pieces of Zeros. The technological gap, he realized, was total. The disparity in firepower was a matter of simple physics. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns each fired 750 rounds per minute. a total of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each bullet weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero's two 7.7mm machine guns fired projectiles weighing 11 grams at 2,300 feet per second, 750 foot-pounds of energy. The Zero also carried two 20mm cannons, but they were slow-firing and had a low muzzle velocity. A Hellcat could put a devastating shotgun-like blast of heavy metal onto a target. The Zero's guns, as one American pilot put it, just made a lot of holes in the armored Hellcat. But more disturbing than the guns was something new, something invisible. American carrier groups were now equipped with powerful new radar. On each carrier in a darkened room called the Combat Information Center, CIC men watched glowing green screens. They could see Japanese formations forming up 50 or 60 miles away. While Japanese pilots still relied on eyesight, the Mark I eyeball, to spot their enemies, Hellcat pilots were being guided to their targets by shipboard radar controllers. Lieutenant Sadamu Kumachi described his first radar-directed interception. "We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. The samurai was being rendered obsolete by the technician. But the Hellcat's deadliest weapon was not its engine, its guns, or its radar. It was a crisis that had begun a year earlier in the fires of a battle that had sealed Japan's fate. June 1942, the Battle of Midway. In 4 days, the Imperial Navy lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers. But the ships were replaceable. What was not replaceable was the man who flew from them. In the flames of the Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu, Japan lost the irreplaceable core of its pre-war veteran pilots. The 700-hour men, the artists, the masters of the Zero. They were gone. Japan had no system for replacing them. Its training program was an artisanal boutique, not a factory. It could not mass-produce 700-hour pilots. By early 1944, the pilot crisis was becoming catastrophic. Desperate to fill the empty cockpits, the Navy slashed training times. The 700-hour minimum became 300 hours, then 200. Army pilots were being sent to the front with as little as 200 hours. Fuel shortages meant most of this training was done in gliders or in outdated biplanes. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot. Formation flying instrument flight, radio procedures all were eliminated to rush bodies to the front. Meanwhile, the American system was a vast industrial pipeline. Naval aviators were arriving in the Pacific with a 300-hour minimum, including 50 hours in the Hellcat. They had practiced carrier landings until they were automatic. They had fired thousands of practice rounds. They had learned energy tactics and the THAC weave in the safety of Texas and Florida airfields. They were not warriors, they were professionals. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer at Kasamigara Naval Air Station, wrote in his final report a month before his own death. "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yesterday, Ensign Yamamoto arrived at the front. He had never fired his guns in flight. We have no ammunition for practice. He had never flown at night. We have no fuel for such training. He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. These 200-hour Japanese pilots were not fighting 300-hour American pilots. They were fighting a system that produced 300-hour pilots by the thousands. The Hellcat wasn't just a plane. It was the endpoint of a colossal industrial and training machine that Japan could not comprehend, much less match. The result of this mismatch green Japanese pilots in lightweight Zeros versus trained American professionals in armored Hellcats was not combat. It was slaughter. October 12th to 16th. 1944, the Battle of Formosa. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, commander of the 2nd Air Fleet, believed he had a chance to inflict a decisive blow. American carriers were raiding Formosa. Fukudome committed everything. Over 700 aircraft, including the last trained pilots from the Homeland Training Squadrons. For 4 days, the skies were filled with combat. The Japanese pilots returned, claiming spectacular victories. 26 American carriers and battleships sunk, 300 aircraft destroyed. The nation celebrated. Emperor Hirohito issued a rescript praising the Navy's victory. The reality discovered only after pilots were debriefed and gun camera footage was developed was catastrophic. Actual American losses: 89 aircraft, 2 cruisers damaged, 0 ships sunk. Japanese losses 329 aircraft and almost every experienced pilot they had left. Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few surviving veterans, described the slaughter in his memoirs. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. As we climbed, they were above us. As we dove, they were below. They had divided the sky into grids, each section covered by a division of fighters. It was not combat. It was systematic extermination. This victory had hollowed out Japan's remaining air power, and the main event was still to come. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy committed its reconstituted carrier force to Operation Ago. This was it, the Kessin, the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power and save the empire. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa, a brilliant tactician, commanded the force. 9 carriers, 450 aircraft, their best remaining pilots. Against them sailed Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher. 15 carriers, 956 aircraft, 450 of them were F6F Hellcats. Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves, confident that the Zero's superior range would allow him to strike the American fleet, while his own carriers remained safe outside the Hellcat's range. The first wave of 69 aircraft launched at 0830. American radar detected them at 150 miles. In the CIC of the flagship, Lexington controllers began to move plots across the board. The system went to work. Hellcats were vectored, guided by radio to the perfect interception point. They would arrive with an altitude advantage, the sun at their backs approaching from the Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the Japanese fighter escort, saw them minutes before engagement. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, at least 60 of them waiting like a steel curtain. We were at 18,000 feet. Every advantage was theirs. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft in that first wave, 42 were shot down. The American pilots could not believe what was happening. Commander David McCampbell Saig of Air Group 15 shot down 7 aircraft in that single day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, got 6. The Zeros tried to turn with us, McCampbell reported. We simply refused. We'd make a high side run, shoot one down, zoom, climb back to altitude. They'd try to follow stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. They were brave, but they were outclassed, and they were badly trained. The second wave was detected, 128 aircraft. More Hellcats rose to meet them. 97 were shot down. The third wave, 47 aircraft, 7 shot down. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, 75 shot down. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost 346 carrier aircraft, plus another 50 land-based aircraft. American losses in the air, 30 aircraft. American pilots sitting in their ready rooms that evening, shaking with adrenaline and disbelief, coined a term for the day's action: the Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot. The enemy aircraft had been as helpless as game birds. Japan's carrier air power, rebuilt so carefully after Midway, had been destroyed in 8 hours by a machine they had dismissed as a failure. The collapse was now total, but the Hellcat's dominance was about to be immortalized. October 24th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Commander David McCampbell, the same pilot who had scored 7 kills at the Turkey Shoot, would set a record that would never be broken. Leading a flight of just 7 Hellcats from the USS Essex, he intercepted a massive force of 60 Japanese aircraft, Zeros and bombers heading for the American fleet. He was outnumbered nearly 8-1. For the next 90 minutes, McCampbell and his wingman, Roy Rushing, tore the Japanese formation to pieces. McCampbell, using his energy fighting tactics to perfection, diving, shooting, climbing, re-engaging, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft. 5 Zeros, 4 bombers. His wingman, Rushing, destroyed 6 more. I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill, McCampbell recorded in his after-action report, his tone purely professional. The Hellcat performed flawlessly throughout. Not a single hit on my aircraft, despite being outnumbered 8-1. The engagement demonstrated the complete absurd reversal of air superiority. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft. They destroyed 15 of them without a single loss. McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day performances earned him the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. He would end the war as the Navy's ace of aces, Ratsari, with 34 victories. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf was not just a military defeat for Japan, it was a psychological collapse. Japanese military psychologists later identified a new condition among surviving pilots, Hellcat psychosis. A crippling fear, a sense of hopelessness, knowing that their aircraft and their training were useless. Admiral Ozawa, in his after-action report for the Philippine Sea, admitted the terrible truth. The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we thought impossible, the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat was not an individual fighter, but a component in a vast machine. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were engaging not planes, but a system. The pilot shortage became so acute that by early 1945, training was reduced to just 40 to 50 hours for Navy pilots. This was not enough time to learn to fight. It was barely enough time to learn to take off and land. These pilots were not being trained to be fighters. They were being trained for one final desperate act. The transformation of Japanese naval aviation from the elite samurai corps of 1941 to the kamikaze operations of 1944 represented the ultimate horrifying admission of the Hellcat's superiority. Unable to compete conventionally, Japan turned its pilots into guided missiles. The logic was cold and in its own way rational. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, the father of the kamikaze, justified it with stark mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. The pilot will die for nothing. If the Zero becomes a bomb, the probability of hitting the carrier increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. On October 25, 1944, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's greatest ace, escorted the first official kamikaze mission. He claimed his 86th and 87th victories, 2 F6F Hellcats in the process. He proved that a master, even in an outdated plane, was still a master. The next day, October 26th, Nishizawa was ordered back to Japan to pick up a new aircraft. He died as a passenger aboard a slow, unarmed transport plane. He was shot down by Hellcats from VF-14. Japan's greatest ace, helpless without his fighter, fell to the very system he had briefly, brilliantly bested. The final battle of the war would be an apocalypse. April to June 1945. Operation Iceberg. The invasion of Okinawa. The Japanese launched 1/900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet. The Hellcat, which had been designed as an offensive weapon, now became the fleet's indispensable defender. Hellcat pilots flew day and night intercepting the waves of suicide aircraft. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leading his Flying Circus division of Hellcats, shot down 23 Japanese aircraft during the campaign. He perfected a new tactic for this new threat. We developed what we called the mowing machine, Valencia explained. 4 Hellcats in line abreast separated by 100 yards would sweep through the Japanese formations at high speed. Each pilot covered his sector. We'd make one pass climb back to altitude and repeat. It was the industrialization of defense. The mathematics of the Okinawa campaign were stark. Hellcats flew 38 Zara 38 combat sorties. They claimed 351 victories. They lost 249 aircraft, a ratio of 9.5 to 1. More significantly, they prevented approximately 80% of the kamikaze aircraft from ever reaching their targets. They saved the fleet. By 1945, the technological gap had become an unbridgeable chasm. The new F6F5 Hellcat incorporated improvements that made it even deadlier. Water injection boosted the engine to 200 horsepower for combat emergencies. Zero-length rocket launchers were added for ground attack, improved armor, and the new K-14 computing gun sight, which automatically calculated the deflection needed to hit a turning target. The samurai were now fighting robots. Saburo Sakai, the ace who had laughed at the Hellcat in 1943, finally encountered them in June 1944 over Iwo Jima. He was flying a new improved Zero. He was one of the few original masters left. Despite his legendary skill and experience, he was nearly killed in his first engagement. "I performed my best aerobatics," he wrote in his autobiography, Samurai Loops Roll Split S. "Every maneuver I had perfected over 200 combats. The Hellcat followed easily, almost casually. I could not shake him. I survived only because the American pilot made an error. He forgot to release his drop tank before combat, which slowed him down just enough for me to escape." The master of the Zero, the man who had flown blind and paralyzed for 60 miles, survived only because his opponent made a rookie mistake. The era of the warrior was over. By the end of the war, the F6F Hellcat's final accounting was written. It had destroyed 523 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. It had lost 270 of its own to enemy fighters. It had achieved a 19.3 to 1 kill ratio. It had produced 305 U.S. Navy aces. It accounted for 75% of all U.S. Navy air-to-air victories. The human cost for Japan was catastrophic. Of the 18,000 elite-trained naval aviators who had started the war, fewer than 100 combat-experienced pilots remained by August 1945. The Corps had been annihilated. August 15,
Japan had no system for replacing them.
At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, the man who had dismissed the Hellcat as weight over finesse, listened to the Emperor's surrender broadcast. The voice high and reedy crackled over the radio. Around him sat the remnants of Japanese naval aviation. Teenage pilots with 40 hours of flight time. Aircraft cobbled together from spare parts. Their fuel tanks were empty. That same day, Ensign Clarence Moore of VF-31, flying from the USS Belleau Wood, spotted a lone Japanese aircraft. It was a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber approaching the American fleet. The time was 2:00 p.m., well after the Emperor's broadcast. The Japanese pilot, apparently unaware of the surrender, was on a final futile attack. Moore intercepted him. 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 guns. The Judy exploded. It was the last aerial victory of World War II, a final quiet punctuation mark at the end of the Pacific Air War. In September 1945, the first American aircraft to land at Atsugi Airfield after the surrender were 12 F6F Hellcats from the USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots, mechanics, and ground crew lined the runway. They were silent. They stared at the Chittimener, seeing it up close for the first time. American pilot Lieutenant Robert Vasu, an ace with 19 victories, put on a show for the defeated Japanese pilots. He performed a series of casual aerobatics, loops, high-speed rolls, and vertical climbs that would have torn the wings off a Zero. The Japanese watched, speechless. "You have to understand," Vasu told them later through an interpreter. "This isn't even pushing it. In combat with water injection, it's 20% more powerful. The plane is stressed for 13 Gs. I've never managed to break one." Japanese engineers studying captured Hellcats after the war discovered the true extent of American industrial superiority. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained 2,840 precision machine parts. Each part was perfectly interchangeable with any other R2800 engine. The Nakajima Sake engine in the Zero required hand-fitting of components. No 2 engines were exactly alike. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, studied the Hellcat extensively. His conclusion was devastating. "We designed an aircraft for 1941. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age. The production of the Hellcat itself had been a weapon. Grumman's Bethpage, New York factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes. The company produced 12 275 Hellcats in 30 months. The Japanese aviation industry simply could not comprehend this. In 1944, Japan produced a total of 5,100 fighters of all types. America produced 35,000 fighters that year alone. The Grumman factory used color-coded instructions. Workers, many of them women who had never built a plane before, assembled complex components with flawless precision. Abundance, not just ideology, won the war. The Hellcat didn't just win battles, it revolutionized naval warfare. Pre-war doctrine assumed carriers were vulnerable platforms that needed to strike first to survive. The Hellcat inverted this. Carriers became mobile fortresses. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, understood this transformation. With the Hellcat, he stated, "We don't need to find them first. Let them come. The F6F will destroy them at our convenience." This confidence, this Hellcat umbrella, allowed American carriers to park off enemy coastlines for weeks, their air power making them essentially invulnerable. Beyond technology, the Hellcat represented a cultural philosophy that invalidated Japanese military doctrine. The samurai tradition emphasized individual excellence, spiritual strength, and the acceptance of death. The Hellcat embodied systematic efficiency, material superiority, and the preservation of the pilot. This philosophical gulf meant Japanese pilots couldn't adapt even when they understood the new tactics. The concept of refusing combat when disadvantaged, fundamental to Hellcat doctrine, was literally unthinkable to a pilot trained in Bushido. In 1962, the United States Navy held a symposium on Pacific War aviation. American and Japanese veterans gathered to discuss the conflict with the perspective of history. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's ace of aces, stated it simply: "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." Commander Saburo Sakai, his one eye clear and reflective, responded, "The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We never understood the difference until it was too late. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost." The Hellcat's dominance can be reduced to simple mathematics that tell a profound story.
Hellcats flew 38,000
A kill ratio of 19 to 1.
Zero-length rocket launchers
To
were added for ground attack.
275 Hellcats produced in 30 months versus 6,000 Zeros produced between 1943 and 1945. Over 5,000 American pilots trained on the Hellcat. Fewer than 100 combat-capable Japanese naval pilots remaining by August 1945. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who had commanded the Japanese fleet at the Philippine Sea, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We laughed at the Hellcat because we didn't understand it. It represented not just an aircraft, but an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai lived until the year 2000. In his final interview, he was asked about the Hellcat. His response captured the totality of its dominance. The Zero made Japan a great naval power. The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. He paused, then delivered the final devastating judgment. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion. The F6F Hellcat entered service weighing twice what the Zero weighed. It carried armor the Zero didn't have. It was powered by an engine the Japanese couldn't build. It was armed with weapons they couldn't match. It was guided by radars they couldn't detect. It was flown by pilots they couldn't equal in training. And it was produced in numbers they couldn't comprehend. Japanese pilots had laughed at it because they didn't understand that every extra pound represented not weakness, but the strength of an industrial democracy that could afford to protect its warriors. By the time they understood, their laughter had turned the last letters home. Their mockery to kamikaze missions. Their confidence to complete collapse. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated the Zero. It had destroyed an entire philosophy of warfare. It proved that in modern combat, the nation that could build the better system would always destroy the nation that could only build the better warrior. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat had the last laugh. It always did.